I'm going to talk about irrigation water quality from the standpoint of suitability for irrigation. It's interesting, we use the term quality a lot in different settings. So Matt just visited with you about water quality and irrigation by preventing the reduction in the quality of surface and groundwater by mismanagement of irrigation. And I'm going to talk about when we take a natural water, look at it for its suitability as an irrigation water source. What kinds of things do we need to look at in terms of quality? We're going to talk about sampling and sample preparation and submission a little bit, similar to what Matt included in his for some of the sampling he was talking about. We're going to go over the quality parameters typically that we use for evaluating the suitability of an irrigation water for use, and the definitions that go with those parameters, the units that are commonly used, so that you, when you get a soil test report or a water test report in this case, can identify where the critical numbers are that you want to be looking at and what they mean. And sometimes you're going to see different units, different measures used from different laboratories, and how do they compare and translate one to another. So we'll go over some of that here. So that's one of the biggest problems with people understanding their test reports when they come, is that laboratories use different terms and different units in reporting these measures. We're going to talk a lot of it actually, about the water use issues associated with various levels of irrigation water quality, the hazards that can be presented to plant health and soil conditions there, and a very little bit about management of the hazards. That's an entire presentation on its own. And Matt's kind of introduced some of that with respect to fertilizer and manure management, but salinity and sodicity management, other things, is a huge part of this, and it's a secondary aspect to what I'll be presenting today. But we will cover some basics there. Irrigation water quality in terms of suitability.
I'm sorry, Grant. Yeah. We don't see a screen if you had shared your screen.
Oh, wow. You know what? There you go. I got busy and I can see it, but you can't. So how's that?
Looks good.
Okay. So when we send in a sample for water quality or water or irrigation suitability analysis, it's really a multifaceted analysis that we're looking for. The key features typically are going to be salinity, sodicity, and some specific ion constituents within the water. Salinity, we're referring to the total dissolved mineral content. When that gets high in the water, as we introduce to the soil, it can reduce water and nutrient uptake by the plant. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. Sodicity really is the sodium content in relation to other elements, particularly calcium and magnesium. Higher sodicity levels can cause soil aggregate and structural breakdown, causing soil crusting, sealing issues, infiltration, and aeration problems. And then there are some specific ions that we need to pay attention to too, that contribute to adverse effects on plants. You generally get two primary features in an irrigation water quality report. You get the level of the various things we've talked about there above, and it'll include some interpretive information or references to interpretive information to say, okay, so I know how much is there, but what does that mean specific to the plants I'm trying to grow and the type of soil that I have, so forth. So let's talk about sampling first. And I apologize, I'm going to take some sips of water as we go along because I've been fighting the flu for the last several days and my voice is kind of giving out here. Excuse me. Sampling methods include really three aspects: the collection of the water, the storage of that water, and its transportation or submission to the laboratory. Depending on the kind of test that we're looking for, some specific analyses require a very specific type of collection vessel. And so you want to check with the lab if there's any specifics related to what you want to have tested. But for most routine testing, and I've for suitability testing almost without exclusion, you can accomplish that by using a clean, used water bottle, like you see pictured there to the right. It's important to rinse that bottle 3 times in and out with the water that you're sampling, and then collect 8 to 12 ounces of sampled water to submit to the laboratory. Be sure that once you have sampled that you seal and dry that container. And if you're testing for what we call non-elemental constituents, Matt mentioned nitrogen and things like that in soil samples and water samples, we need to make sure that we transport that to the lab or ship it overnight so that the sample reaches the lab within 24 hours. For all other things, the salinity, the sodicity, the constituent element analysis and things, we just need to get it to the laboratory as soon as we possibly can. For irrigation suitability analysis, no preservatives or acid additions are generally needed, as they would be maybe if you're familiar with the instructions for collecting drinking water samples, which would require a stricter preparation of the sample for submission to the laboratory. Typically, the sample submission instructions are provided by your chosen lab. For instance, if you go to soiltest.usu.edu, that's our soil, water, and plant testing laboratory here on campus in Logan. There are specific instructions for how to sample and how to submit the sample and that you can download there and follow. So when we send that sample in, a complete irrigation water suitability analysis includes several important aspects: that the total concentration of soluble salts, or the salinity, the relative proportion of the sodium to other cations, the bicarbonate concentration, particularly for well waters that we might be sampling compared to the calcium and magnesium content in that water, and the concentration of other specific elements and compounds there. It's really the interplay of all of these that provides the context upon which we'll determine the suitability of that water for irrigation. So let's take a look at some of these in more detail. Here is kind of just a compilation of common salts we find in Western US irrigation waters, very common to the ones we find typically here in Utah, in our valleys, both in our surface and shallow groundwaters, well waters, and things. I won't go through the whole list, but you can see them here in their chemical symbols. If we take a look at any natural water, all waters contain some dissolved minerals. Salinity then, that mineral content, the dissolved mineral content's measured in 2 different ways: either by the electrical conductivity of the water or a total dissolved solids content measurement. And we'll look at these and the units that are used and how we go between these different measures so that you can make comparisons to analyses you might get from different sources. Higher levels of salinity are a problem because it can cause a restriction in plant water uptake. High dissolved solute content in a water reduces the ability of the water to move from solution across the plant membrane and into the root and up the shoot. It's an osmotic issue, and so higher levels of salinity in both irrigation waters and soil solutions can actually mimic a drought, and so the plant doesn't thrive. You'll see it stunted in its growth, perhaps in extremes where it might be wilting, and even in more extremes where you can see it kind of drying out, desiccating, or what we call burning up a little bit there. So a bit long before we get to those levels, we can still be reducing plant productivity, and we'll talk about that more here in detail. Sodium salts present a secondary hazard, and we measure sodicity by what we call the SAR test, or the sodium adsorption ratio test. Which looks at the balance of sodium to calcium and magnesium in the water. At high levels of that ratio, soil aggregates and soil structure can break down, resulting in infiltration and aeration challenges. So let's take a look at these measures and their typical units, and so that you're going to recognize them when you see them on a water test report. EC, or electrical conductivity, will be measured in conductivity measures, electrical conductivity measures. So millimos per centimeter, or micromos per centimeter, or decisiemens per meter. Those are the typical units that you'll see reported. And I'll show you in a minute what the relation between those types of units are, so that you can go between them if you see them expressed in different ways on different test reports. TDS is the other way of measuring total salinity. That's the total dissolved solids, and that's reported on milligrams of the salt per liter of solution, or parts per million. And numerically, those are equivalent. So they do compare directly one with another. The sodium hazard, as I mentioned, will be reported as an SAR, the sodium absorption ratio. It's a unitless number. It's a ratio of the concentration of sodium to the other cations in the solution. Let's take a look at these as they compare to one another here in a minute. These are what would be what you would see in terms of units of the individual elemental constituents of elements and compounds within the test report. Typically, you'll see those elements reported on a moles per cubic meter basis. We can go to milligrams per liter simply by multiplying by the molecular weight of the element itself. And you do look that up on a periodic table or reference table for that. But I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. I just provide this conversion chart for you. I've pulled it from a reference that I cite at the end, so you can go back to that particular document and pull these out. They're ready references. I think they're very convenient to have. Or you can go back to this recorded lecture later on and pull these out. But decisiemens per meter and millimos per centimeter are numerically equivalent, so they're a one-to-one comparison. Millimos and decisiemens per meter are 1,000 times bigger than micromos. And so you can go between these if you see them expressed in various units on different soil test reports. A milligram per liter, as I mentioned, is numerically equivalent to 1 part per million. And then there's the different descriptions of things down here just for your reference there. We can convert between the total dissolved solids and the electrical conductivity of the solution in a two-phased conversion, and you can see the limits where the two equations of conversion apply, and you get a good estimate of electrical conductivity from total dissolved solids, or vice versa, from these conversion equations. So once we have the numbers and we kind of understand what the numbers represent and how they compare one to another, how do we interpret how important they are to the suitability of that water for use? So we have to have interpretations that go with that. That's the other facet of these test reports that you generally receive. And so you'll get general classes, and these are very general, for the suitability of a water with respect to the electrical conductivity. In this case, this is in micromos. If we wanted this on decisiemens per meter or millimos per centimeter, we would divide by 1,000 on these numbers here. But it shows you that you have excellent suitability when you're at 250 or less micromos. Or for TDS in this column, this would be the TDS column, around 175 parts per million total dissolved solids. So you can see how you can read this table in order to get a rough interpretation of the salinity hazard associated with a given water test level for salinity. And I mentioned that these are general. Every single plant that you might be interested in growing will have a specific tolerance level to salinity. And so you get a good idea of the general suitability, but then you'll need to take it one step further, as I'll show later, and take a look at the sensitivity of a specific plant to the salinity level in your water. As far as the sodicity hazard is concerned, SAR values of below 10 are generally useful on all crops, except for maybe the really most sensitive crops, and we don't grow a lot of avocados in Colorado, in Utah, or in the Intermountain West, so we're pretty safe there. Once we get up above 10 to about 18, then things like amendments such as gypsum, a soluble calcium source, would be needed to replace sodium in the soil and reduce the ratio of sodium to the other cations. And then we need to make sure that we remove excess sodium from the system through leaching of the soil materials. Once we get above 18, typically these are generally unsuitable for use as an irrigation water source. One of the things we need to point out, in particular when we're using a well water, for instance, bicarbonate content is one of those facets of a irrigation water suitability test report I mentioned. This is a common constituent of well waters in many places around the state. Bicarbonate will precipitate with calcium in the water and in the soil, and that then increases the sodium hazard because it increases the ratio of sodium to the free calcium. And in those cases where bicarbonate is found, the lab should provide what is called an adjusted SAR value, which reflects that increased hazard for bicarbonate content. So be sure if that's provided there that you pay attention to that, because then that will adjust upward the hazard level of that particular water. As I mentioned, those are these are general values for the suitability of a water with respect to salinity, but specifically every single plant has a tolerance to salinity in the soil and in the water. Here are the sensitivities of a number of different vegetable crops for irrigation water EC. And so this is electrical conductivity in decisiemens per meter. You can see that most of our vegetable crops are okay up until about 1 and 1.5 or so. They don't have any reduction in productivity. But as you get increasing amounts of salt in the water, you can see a fall off in productivity here, represented by the yield potential reduction as we get higher and higher. Some of the most sensitive crops, say carrots, for instance, you're going to lose 50% of your yield potential just in a few units of increase in salinity in an irrigation water. And so pay attention to the crops you're actually growing. And if you tell the laboratory what you're planning on irrigating with that water, you should get the tailored recommendation or hazard expressed for that particular crop and soil type. Fruit crops are even more sensitive than some of our vegetable crops and ornamental plants in the landscape. You can see here some of our really popular things like apple and peach have a really low threshold for salinity before they start to fall off in productivity, and they fall off quite fast with respect to increases in salinity of the irrigation water. So we need to interpret these on the basis of individual plant salt tolerances as we go along. There's extensive tables that I'll refer to at the end of the presentation for these, so that you can choose, in many cases, where depending on your soil and water test reports, the kinds of plants that will do well or not in those particular conditions. Water quality hazards with respect to specific ions within a water also can be an issue, particularly with chloride content. And chloride will often be one of those constituent ions, specific ions, that are reported in a water test report. You can see here that these are the max concentrations of chloride in moles per cubic meter or in parts per million or milligrams per liter that are allowable for various vegetable types and fruits. Strawberry, onion, lettuce are quite sensitive to chloride, and they will only get to about 10 before they'll start falling off in their productivity. Potatoes a little bit more tolerant. Tomato and broccoli are even more tolerant as you go along. But you can see that even with these individual specific ion concerns with hazards, particularly chloride, we have to have some interpretation value there too for our water test reports to make sense to us. Wanted to a couple of items on management here before I have an opportunity to take some questions. We emphasize many times, and I hope that this will be a take-home message for all throughout the presentations that have been made, is that salts cannot be neutralized in waters or soils. You can't add an amendment that will make the salt go away or lessen its hazard in a soil or water. These are elemental constituents and they must be physically removed. They can be removed in some cases from waters through various processes, reactive resin filters or reverse osmosis. Somebody mentioned solar distillation at an earlier point in our session. All of those processes are very expensive in getting the water cleaned of its solutes. Excess salts in soils can only be removed through leaching. And so we have to maintain a good balance. So knowing what we have in the water to start with and what concerns it may present in terms of what the soil accumulation of salts will be over time and the effects that it may have on the plants that we're growing will be considered as we create a salinity management strategy within the soil to keep them moving downward out of the root zone, leaching out of the profile, so that we can maintain conditions that are conducive to optimal plant growth. We irrigate as then to ensure that movement of salts to the outer edges and below the root zone of the primary root zone. If we're using drip, for instance, the drip line should be in line with the rows so that they push water out and away from the plant and down, or deep watering in the case of trees, shrubs, and other things there, that we're moving the water down and out as much as possible, taking the salts with it. We also then focus on choosing salt-tolerant plants that are suitable for the water and soil conditions that were presented. And for sodic issues, we have to add a soluble calcium source. And I'm sure that you've heard at one point or another that gypsum, for instance, is a great soil conditioning amendment. That is true if you have a sodium imbalance or a sodic issue where you need to replace sodium in the mix with a calcium source. But in order to accomplish a reclamation of that sodic issue, you still need to leach and remove the excess sodium and excess salt added with the gypsum addition. And so be mindful of that. Unless you have a sodium imbalance, adding gypsum as a soil amendment is simply adding more salt to your soil, which we very much do not need in our Western U.S. soils for the most part. Here are some important sources that I've used in preparing this presentation today. A really great extension bulletin that was developed by a counterpart of mine at Texas A&M, Texas AgriLife Extension Bulletin there, referenced to called Irrigation Water Quality Standards and Salinity Management Strategies. I highly recommend that for you. You can Google that and typically find it online. And we have a great website prepared by Dr. Yost that you've heard from, Burdette Barker, who will speak to you soon here as one of our moderators today, and others that have contributed to that. That's the URL there for it, or you can just Google USU Extension Irrigation Water Sampling Guide, and you'll get a hit there. If all else fails, there's my email. You can contact me directly, and I'll direct you to those resources, provide them for you. so that you don't have to memorize all those tables I just presented in the presentation. But they're important for you to be able to put context on the values you get from your water test analyses. So with that, I'm done a few minutes early, and we've got time to take some questions.
Grant, I'll jump in. I know Burdette's kind of multitasking, or Jose, are you?
Oh,
Yeah.
yes.
Why don't you moderate for Grant? That'd be great. Thanks.
Hi, Grant. We have two questions. The first one is, what is the average salinity of the water coming from Utah Lake?
Highly variable, as it turns out, depending on where you're at and what time of year. It's generally not terrible. That water moves up through the Jordan Water Conservancy District and others, and is used for a lot of irrigation purposes. It's typically got some pretty good quality with respect to irrigation. Now, you would concern about things like your algal blooms and other things that you were talking about earlier, Jose, in terms of the hazard analysis for other purposes. But I can't give you a number offhand, but I know for most of the time, our water test reports we get from that area are reasonably suitable for irrigation.
Thank you. Another question that we have here is, what advice would you have for farmers who have soils that are naturally salty or have sodic soils where leaching is not a viable option? Would raised bed be the only options to grow most specialty crops?
Yeah, that's a concern we have. But when we talk about leaching as a method of reclamation on these soils, typically you have to have some drainage freeboard available to you, and typically we'd say that you'd have to have at least 6 to 8 feet of freeboard above the local water table in order to accomplish that. Otherwise, you're going to get continued wicking of salt up from the shallow water table back into the root zone. If artificial leaching is, putting in drain lines and other things is not a possibility, you can always go to more tolerant crops, specialty crops and things like that, barley, some of our pasture grasses and other things. But if you're looking at trying to do vegetable farming and other things, you really are limited in those cases. And so, yes, some kind of grow box above ground, artificial growing medium and things like that are typically going to be your only avenue for success there. And I would include the fact that in that case, you still don't want to have your soil material in contact with the natural soil. Otherwise, it's going to continue to wick salts up into the lower reaches, even of your raised bed. So you're going to have to keep those separate in some way.